All right, so I'm actually pretty excited about these ones because whenever I see a topic that you review that is something that I've been interested in, I thought I knew a good amount about, or I just had a really opinion. I already had a bias towards one side. I'm always curious to see what you find, to see if it supports me or if it crushes me. So, which is the NSAIDs one is the one that I'm really interested in, which is the one we'll get into first. But they're both really good, and the blog did really well. So for anybody listening to this, if you haven't checked out the blog yet, you can check this podcast out in writing form with the graphs and everything included on the website, and I'll link that in the description. But Brandon, go ahead and take it away and dive into the first study for us.
Yeah, so the first one is on NSAIDs and specifically ibuprofen. And I've been following this research for, I don't know, a decade or so. And it's kind of like hit or miss on what happens. But before this study, and it's a little bit older, but before this study, there were no like long-term outcomes, right? And that's what we generally care about. So what they did in this study specifically was they had about 20 people, mostly males, but there were some females in there. And they were, 25-ish trained people, which is really important too. A lot of the previous studies were on untrained people, and we know there are differences there, especially when it comes to DOMs and like muscle protein synthesis and stuff. But they gave them in a double-blind manner, so researchers don't know, participants don't know if they're getting placebo or ibuprofen. And they gave them 2 pills that were 200 milligrams, so like one in the morning and one in the evening. So that's 400 milligrams total. And they did, this is the fun part, they did arms for 6 weeks, and they did it 5 days a week. So they basically did a ton of bicep curls. And the training protocol
kind of program.
Yeah, right. It's like anything. There's a couple big studies with arms, and I'm like, this is so much better than doing like legs.
Yeah.
So the actual training session wasn't that hard. It was just 3 sets of 8 to 10, so like 70% 1RM, and then 3 sets of 4 to 6 at 100% of their max. So like with a 3-second eccentric. So just eccentrics, right? We use those to get stronger a lot, and they're not terrible. This protocol would probably give me elbow tendonitis. It definitely would. And they had kind of short rest intervals between exercises, so it was only a minute. But again, arms, they recover pretty fast. Like a minute's not too bad. Okay, so you got your 2 groups, placebo or ibuprofen, 6 weeks of arms. What happens? Well, when they compared the 2 groups, both of them gained about 25% in their 1RM of bicep curl. So no differences there on strength. And that's not surprising given the literature. It kind of makes sense that they would both get stronger. It would have to be a huge effect for the ibuprofen group to not get stronger. And then they looked at muscle soreness, which is probably one of the more interesting components, because when I reach for ibuprofen, it's usually for like joint soreness or just stiffness or aches or whatever, not necessarily for DOMs. But they found that the placebo didn't have an effect at all when you compare it to ibuprofen, the other way around, ibuprofen to a placebo. So it didn't help with muscle soreness. And this is just like a soreness scale. Like they'll touch your bicep and be like, how sore are you on a scale of 1 to 10 type thing, or 1 to 20. So no differences there. And that was kind of surprising. And the most important one, for people who like looking good, muscle size, right? So they found no differences between the groups there either, and both groups increased bicep thickness by 8%, which is a good amount considering that was only 6 weeks. Like independent of the treatments, like 8% bicep size in 6 weeks, that's pretty good size, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to take all that home, basically giving we'll call this low dose ibuprofen for 6 weeks in the arm, doing an arm protocol didn't really interfere with any strength or muscle gains. So that's kind of the take home on the study.
Was there a study not too long ago? I feel like I saw Dr. Andy Galpin talking about this, but I may be mistaken, that kind of did the same thing, but with ice baths?
I think, yeah. And ice baths are definitely something I'm going to cover in the future. I'm just like working up to it because there's been a
Yeah.
string of like 5 studies published in the past 2 or 3 months, which makes her for a really good series and kind of a build up. Yeah.
And part of the study that I'm thinking about, I believe they alluded to hypertrophic response was lower when using the ice bath. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's where the data is trending right now. It's like not good for hypertrophy.
So the way I always looked at ibuprofen or really any anti-inflammation tool or supplement or anything is keeping it away from training because my main goal is to build muscle. But if I had somebody doing CrossFit and they had a competition where they had a session in the morning, session at night, I'm like, take ibuprofen and jump in an ice bath in between those because it's not going to limit your strength. If anything, it's going to help because you're going to recover faster and it's going to help that inflammation before your next event, which is only hours away.
Mm.
But if I'm trying to build muscle and my next session is tomorrow, to me, it makes more sense to just deal with it, let my body naturally adapt to it. And I assumed that ibuprofen was the same exact way as the ice bath.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of thought that too until I saw this study. And I don't know that most people would reach for ibuprofen because of like DOMS or a normal like workout like this, but in the realm of CrossFit, like that does happen. Or like if you're just training for any event, like pick a like runners, whatever, you generally have this like pain threshold where you're like, okay, if I can get through this, I'll just take some ibuprofen for a couple weeks or a couple days or whatever and get through it, then I'm good to go.
Yeah.
So that is probably more standard, but nobody's done any studies on that yet. So I don't know basically how that would affect anything. The closest, I'm trying to think the closest to that. There was a study with ibuprofen and people who ran a marathon. So they gave it to them like after marathon, because that would definitely be a time you would probably take it. And it followed up later, and there were some satellite cell effects, which could translate to muscle adaptations later, showing that ibuprofen stopped the satellite cells from activating and recovering. So it's like inhibiting your recovery long term. But this idea, or the idea of ibuprofen being bad, comes from a couple of studies, probably like 20 years ago now, where they gave it and then they measured muscle protein synthesis, and then they said, hey, look, muscle protein synthesis is down. So that means, I mean, they didn't say this, but this is what people took from it. That means that you're not going to grow muscle as well if you take ibuprofen. The only problem with a lot of these studies is that they give like 1,200 milligrams, which is like the most you're supposed to have in 24 hours. And I'd be curious just to see how much ibuprofen do you take when you normally take it, like just for fun.
Yeah. If I'm taking ibuprofen, it's usually 400 or 600 milligrams. And 400 is the max on the bottle because it's a 200 milligram pill and it says 2 at most, and I'll take 3. But that's like, I'm feeling
Yeah.
risky.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. Like I'll usually take 400 mgs. I feel like that's a standard extra strength, right? You
Yeah.
get the bottle. It's like, oh, this is good. This will fix me up. But you don't take it like twice a day. You just take it once, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard to translate some of this stuff, but I wanted to look into it. Mostly these 2 studies are really for my self-interest and less other people like interests, but also something we can reference in the future, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Luckily, a lot of our listeners have the same interests as us, so
yeah.
it works
Yeah.
out. One thing that kind of comes to mind that I would want to ask is, uh, especially for the listeners to better understand, is like, what is the inflammatory response or effect on the muscle when you train? Like, what is actually going on from an inflammatory level? Because depending on the severity, I got to imagine it depends on what you're doing. A squat with a bar on your back might create more systemic inflammation than a bicep curl. So would this translate to those things, or does it change depending on what we're doing and the degree of that inflammation? Because running a marathon, there's probably way more inflammation. That's a long duration race. So that transfer of the satellite cell issue happening, is that because of the degree of what you're doing to an extent? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a good question because there's not a very good answer, so I can kind of speculate a bit. So we need inflammation to adapt, like straight up. If you block it, you don't adapt, and bad things happen. But we don't want to block all of it, or, again, bad things happen. So we have to figure out how much do we need to stop inflammation to really benefit whatever we're trying to do. And, that depends on the person, of course, but I don't think that we have a great answer. I do totally agree with the certain things cause way more inflammation than others. Like some of these muscle damage protocols, you're going to get way more damage with that than you are in a normal session. But there's also something else to consider, and that is, so we have systemic inflammation. Like you said, a marathon would probably increase your systemic inflammation. But then we have muscle-specific inflammation. And actually older people who train, they actually have this, and people who have a lot of just muscle-specific inflammation don't respond as well to training. So I did a study about that a couple of years ago. But in terms of how much inflammation do we want to block, or how much even really exists, it's really hard to give a good answer on that, because it's I could tell you, TNF alpha, right, cytokine inflammation increases 5-fold, right, but that doesn't really mean anything, and we can't really even measure it. So I think the hard part is getting stuff that you can actually measure, as a coach or as an athlete, and using that to guide what you're doing, instead of using how you feel necessarily. But we don't have any of that data, so science continues.
I think speculating in general is totally fine for us, but something that I would speculate is, and this is kind of bro-ish, but the way I look at it is speaking of adaptation, you do hard things, you harden up, right? And then you get better at them because you can handle more. And I think that applies to everything, but I look at this is the same thing with muscle damage. Actually, muscle damage doesn't really matter that much for muscle growth. We don't think that it's just a byproduct of what you're doing. But I always go back to the thought of, okay, well, old school bodybuilders who are jacked, or the guys that are just still in the gym, just grinding away, that you can't explain why they're so jacked. They swear by muscle damage. Why is that? Well, they're pushing themselves hard enough to create muscle damage, but it's the effort to get there that causes the growth. So you should still probably see some soreness every once in a while. If you're never sore at all, it's probably not a good thing. Another thing, bodybuilders and people like that, they don't drown in ibuprofen to help with their soreness. They just deal with it. So to me, I'm I watch some of those things and I follow suit, and sometimes that helps too for people. Even I even talk to people about this with low carb dieting. I'm who's the best at getting extremely lean? Bodybuilders. Okay. Do any of them really follow low carb diets? I mean, at the end, it's just a low everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't even count. But if you look at most bodybuilders, they actually follow a lower fat diet, if anything. And we know that there's some science behind that, but I do think at times it's fine to speculate towards what you see and just kind of your intuition. Because I've told people hey, if you can avoid taking ibuprofen after a session, or I've even, and this might be wrong, so you can correct me, but I've even said hey, let's not take, if you train at 6 a.m, I don't want you taking your fish oil and antioxidants and all these vitamins and minerals right before your training. Save them for night when it's way away from your training. You still get them in every day, but fish oil is another one of those anti-inflammatories. And to me, I'm let's just keep it away from the training window.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any issue with that. Going back to your embracing the grind thing, that's that is how you have get bigger eventually, or get better at that. Once you reach a certain level, you just have to push, and it sucks.
Yeah.
So I there's a line that you try not to cross, right? And that's usually right before you get injured. That line, you're I don't know, let me stick my toe over there. No, maybe. Oh, okay. Oh, we went too far. Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yep.
So
I just recently did that, and I hurt my back, and it was the first time I'd taken ibuprofen in a while. And actually, they were prescription grade ibuprofens, and they were 600 milligrams. So going back to dosage, doctors prescribe one pill at 600 milligrams, and that's you got to get it over the counter shit. So 1200 is a lot in one sitting.
Yeah, for sure. And I generally tell people when they ask, I'm so, if you want to take it occasionally, it's fine. Just don't be the person who's taking an ibuprofen every single day. That's probably not
Yeah.
good for you.
Yeah. Related to ibuprofen, not related to muscle, gut health. Is there any evidence to show that ibuprofen is negative on the liver, on the gut, or anything like that? Because I've heard that as well, as like, taking all that shit is not good on your gut. And I've even had like my dad has gone through hip surgery, and I know when he takes pain meds, his gut gets all fucked up, and he tries to avoid it because of that.
Yeah, so that is one of the biggest side effects and like adverse events to taking ibuprofen is just gastrointestinal pain, discomfort. I mean, it's not good on your gut, especially if you're taking large dosages for long periods. In terms of gut health, you may have stumped me, or there might not be any research. I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody's looked at, people taking ibuprofen and how it changes their gut microbiota. That would be cool. That'd be a good study, man.
I'm
Writing
surprised
that
they haven't
down.
done that yet. I feel like they're trying to do everything with gut health, and I mean, there's a lot on artificial sweeteners and stuff like that, but it'd be an interesting thing. And again, that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, is like just listening to your body and being intuitive. Like if you are relying on ibuprofen and your gut is a mess, then put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah, for sure. I just got results back from a study on a microbiome study with a ketone ester, and nothing changed. And I was like, wait, what? They're like, no, there's no differences. There's nothing changed in the gut from taking a ketone ester. I'm like, okay, I don't believe you, but that's fine.
Why is that for the people listening? Explain that, and explain what a keto ester is.
So a ketone ester is kind of one of the supplements. So ketones are kind of being pushed as some kind of performance enhancement. Now, there's a ton of studies that basically say they don't, except in like these super elite athletes who are using them on the Tour de France. And so I just had a very simple question, and the question was, does giving someone ketone esters change the makeup, like their bugs in their gut, right? And it turns out it doesn't, even if you do it for like 6 to 8 weeks. So it's kind of one of those things in science where you're like, no, there's that ketone is definitely doing something, and then you kind of come back, you're like, I guess not.
Why do you find it hard to believe that it didn't create any result?
Because almost everything you do changes the gut a little bit. And I just I don't know. I just had a feeling. It's just one of those science feelings, man.
Yeah. Well, and then also if there's not 10 studies on it, then we don't really know yet. There's a lot to be done. And it's actually, I was thinking about this when I was getting this blog up on the website. When I read your research roundups, when I read Weightology, when I read Mass, anything, it's like what's next is kind of the question. Like, what do we get? Almost every single time there's a request for more research to be done. It's like, well, we need more research, but what I think is, or like, I'd really like to see a study like this, and it's always like, we need more evidence.
Yeah, so I was talking to some other researchers, and there was this like idea, right? This grand idea where like, if we all picked one topic, right? If we all picked like volume and hypertrophy and just did studies on that, like 20 to 50 researchers for like 2 years or 3 years, we could have not a finite answer, but like the closest thing we could get to an answer. And everybody kind of looked at me and was like, what? No. Like, but we can answer questions that way. They're like, no, it doesn't. No, we're not going to do that. Pipe dream.
Yeah, that's a lot of time.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into number 2, which I actually think is, this kind of relates to, I believe, something that you were talking to the team about on one of the educational prezos, and something I asked you to kind of dig into a while back based on something I read out of Fat Loss Forever, the book. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And this is, so Lane and, oh man, I forgot who the other author is. They definitely reference this study and a couple other ones.
Okay.
But I have a colleague, a really close friend, who does fat cell biology. And so we worked in the same lab for a little bit, and we were always pinging ideas because like fat cells are not super like well studied. And they're like, is no one studying them in exercise science and like with exercise. So I just like when you read that literature, you don't see it very often. And the reason is, I'll tell you a story at the end of all this. But the reason is fat biopsies, and they suck. But this study had 600 people, 700 people, somewhere in that realm. Big study. And it was a cross-sectional study. So that means you have all of your data from one time point, right?
Mm.
So you come in, you get something done on a whole bunch of people, and then you compare it. You don't follow them over a certain period. You just got one time point. But with that, you can do a lot of correlations. You can split up your data in different ways. Maybe have some lean people and obese people, and you want to look at one of the things you measured. So that's kind of what the study did. But so this study also combined data from a bunch of other studies that this research group has done. And we call that a secondary analysis, which is totally fine. It's usually when people have questions and they're like, well, we have this data. Let's see if we can answer the question we have with the data. And the question was, do people have more fat hypertrophy or fat hyperplasia when they're lean or obese, right? So when your fat cells do they expand or do they multiply? And does it matter? And so they created some formulas for body fat, and then they created some other formulas for to categorize the fat cells as having hyperplasia or hypertrophy. And then they did their analysis. And what they found was there's this kind of like curvilinear response where the more fat you had, the more fat cells you had up to a point, and then it kind of leveled off. But if you think about that in terms of people, right, you kind of get people who level off at a certain amount of fat mass. Like you look around the general population, like yes, there's a lot of variability, and they had a lot of variability in the study, but there's more kind of overweight and slightly obese people than there are like super obese people. And if going back to the hyperplasia or hypertrophy component, so they have all this data, and they said, well, if you're above this line, you have the hyperplasia. If you're below this line, you have hypertrophy. And so then they looked at men and women, and they didn't notice any differences like between hyperplasia and hypertrophy. So it's okay. Well, there's no sex effect or gender effect. Then they kind of looked and said, well, maybe if people are obese, they have more hypertrophy, or maybe they have more hyperplasia. I don't know which happens. And from the data, it didn't matter if you're obese or not. You had a very, very similar amount of hyperplasia and hypertrophy. So this tells us basically, as you're getting bigger or fatter, like technically fat mass is expanding, you're creating more fat cells up to a point, and then they're just getting bigger and you're not creating more. And the application of that is, okay, well, can we stop it? Does it matter? And this is just that there's no difference and it happens to everybody and we can't control it. That's all this paper is really saying. So this was kind of like a characterization of fat cells. And then there's a couple like gyms in there, like fat cell turnover and stuff. But ultimately, they didn't really find any differences between the fat cell in lean or obese people, or there's not really any difference if you classify it as hyperplasia or hypertrophy. So I don't know that we can say it's good to create more fat cells or create bigger fat cells. If we relate this to other literature, bigger fat cells are generally worse. So they are more promoting of inflammation and other kind of insulin resistance problems. So that's kind of the sum of this study for now.
Would it be of concern if you are multiplying fat cells, then you have more of an opportunity to expand those fat cells, and then it becomes a real issue? Because in my mind, the way it works is like, I understand a bigger fat cell might cause more health issues, but the more fat cells we have, it could be potentially harder to lose weight because of that. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. So the problem with making more fat cells is, I won't say they never go away, but they pretty much never go away. And that's why fat loss is so difficult, is because these fat cells are putting off adipokines, which are just cytokines from fat cells. And they're telling your body different things. And if you can never remove that signal, right, that's probably bad. Even, this was kind of a cool study, even if you get liposuction, you're not taking out like just fat cells. You're taking out a mix of like big and little fat cells. So you don't actually reduce your fat cell number that much, which is ridiculous. Let's see. The other thing that I touched on in the blog, and I think this we could probably relate to. I don't know if you're a fat kid, but I was definitely a fat kid.
I was.
Is that when you're growing up, essentially, that's when you see kind of the most fat cell expansion. I mean, which makes sense to a point, like 12 or 13, sure, you need fat. But then it levels off like at 20 to 25, your fat cell number, right? So if you can, in that gap, like maybe the later stages between like 20 and 25, kind of lower that ceiling and not get overweight, or not be overweight as a kid, and then you're overweight as a teenager, and then you're overweight as an adult. Right? If you can kind of bring those cell numbers down over the long term of your life, it's probably going to be better. Which is partly why we have like an obesity epidemic.
That makes a lot of sense as to why, like, people ask all the time, like, why is the last 5 pounds so hard to lose? It's probably because of this exact thing, right? That's where, especially if you're, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's more difficult to lose that last 5 pounds, quote unquote, for those who have lost weight multiple times, right? They've lost weight, gained some back, lost weight, gained some back. And this is kind of what the concept of the book was talking about. Every time you regain that weight, you're multiplying fat cells and you're giving them an opportunity to grow. So now every time you come back to the diet, it becomes more difficult. Is that correct?
Yes. So we don't know for sure that you're like multiplying fat cells, but they're getting like bigger again. And then once they reach a point, they'll probably multiply a little bit too. That all kind of depends on how fat you are, how much weight you have. But yeah, I mean, it's not good to weight cycle, right? And that's what a lot of people do.
Now, for a bodybuilder, you have to weight cycle. So
yeah,
my question there would be, is this just more evidence to show like, hey, maybe a slightly leaner gaining phase would be more helpful? Like, by that, I mean, hey guys, you're not going to stay shredded while you try to gain muscle, but like not doing a dreamer bulk, which we've all done.
yes. I think if anything in the past 6 months I've learned, it's that you should never do a dreamer bulk. You should not gain at a very quick rate, like, because you're gonna put on fat cells, right? And once you have them, you can't really get rid of them. So why take someone lean, especially if you're like lean at baseline, like if you're, kind of like you are normally, and then get them fat and then get them lean again? Like it's just, you're like setting them up for failure. It's terrible. Oh,
Yeah.
I wish I could like shout that from mountaintops. Like,
please
don't bulk fast.
Yeah, it's fun, but don't do it. It's the hard part for people is really just like the commitment, like if you look at the people who do it the right way, it's like, hey, they spent 8 months gaining, and people are like, wait, I have to eat in a surplus and train really hard for 8 months straight consistently. And it's like, bingo. I mean, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, like, because they've trained the same amount of time I have, but 10 years every single week. I mean, there's obviously times where I went on vacation or I got hurt or whatever, but every week for 10 years is a long fucking time. I'm not that big, but my point being is like, you got to spend time. Like, there's just no way around it, especially if you're natural. And I would say this is actually just an observation, but it would line up with this and make sense. There's a thing inside of bodybuilding, like natural bodybuilding, where like older competitors get more conditioned. Like, they just tend to be more conditioned. It's like almost like you age like fine wine, right? Like, you just get better. Yeah. But I think if you look at those people who you can use as examples, they don't really get fat in the off season. They tend to stay pretty lean, and they get to a point, and I think they do it because, well, now I'm 45, so I can't really build much muscle, so I'm just going to stay leaner and just focus on strength in the off season, and then it'll be an easier cut going to prep. But what they're probably doing is limiting this from happening and causing more fat accumulation, which is probably accurate too, because they're obviously not going to build as much muscle being over 40. I think it slows down at like 30, right? Building muscle.
I mean, I would say it's more like 40. There's a plateau, we'll call it, around 40. And I mean, sure, like if you had a couple years where like you weren't working out as much, or like you had kids, or you just got distracted, right? You could probably like dip down a little bit and then come back up. But you're not like putting on 10 pounds of muscle above the age of like 40 without some help. Unless you have just not been training right. Like straight, like, yeah. But if you've been doing everything right for 10, 15 years, you're probably pretty maxed out.
The only time I've seen a client make a pretty good leap in muscle growth, and they were in their 40s, and this was after working with them for almost a year of like really slow progress and not really getting anywhere. I shouldn't say not getting anywhere, but we're more focused on staying lean and health and all that stuff. He had extremely low testosterone levels, and they were trying to do all these natural things to help. And his doctor finally prescribed him just TRT. And that's helped significantly. And it was one of those things where it's like, he doesn't look like Mr. Olympia. So you wouldn't walk up to that guy and be like, you're taking testosterone. But it definitely gave him the little nudge to be like, all right, let's build some muscle again, because you're putting a lot of work in the gym, and, you know, we need some help. So I feel like that's one caveat that would be out there.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like I have one of my friends he's a PA, and so he's like a family medicine guy, and he's like, he comes to me. He was visiting last week. He's like, Brandon, you will not believe how many TRT prescriptions I give out. He's like, all those dudes in the gym that were like 40, like they're all on TRT. I'm like, well, do you blame them? He's like, no, not really. Their testosterone was low. I was like, well, it sounds like they're using it right then.
Yeah.
They're like jacked.
Shit. I'll tell you, I'll be the first to admit, when I'm in my 40s or 50s, or whenever I feel like I'm tapped out, and if the blood work does not show a number I like, I'm going to do it. Why not? I mean, it's not, I think where it gets misconstrued, and this is obviously going way off topic, but I was talking to somebody about this recently too, because they were asking questions like, isn't that steroids though? And I was like, steroids is like a big umbrella of a whole bunch of shit. Like, you got to go Breaking Bad in order to do it properly, where it's a concoction. You know, you have a little bit of growth hormone, a little bit of insulin, a little bit of tren, a little bit of testosterone, a little bit of whatever, and you're doing all these things in sync at certain levels, which makes it, honestly, that's the scariest part to me. It's like, I'm too afraid to mess any of that up to even try to be taking that. Whereas TRT it's literally just testosterone, you know, and
it's not much.
No. And unfortunately, the way human society lives today, testosterone's at an all-time low for most people. It's
scary.
Everything, stress, artificial light, the way we eat, it's bad. And I think it's funny because, like, even myself, I get blood work done like usually at least once a year, sometimes twice. And I was in range, but it's funny because the range gets lower. So I was like, damn, did they drop the range again? Now the low number is 200 something. Like, it used to be in the 400s. And he was like, oh yeah, they lowered the range a little bit. Now it's, 200 to 800. And I was like, so basically, as America gets more unhealthy, you're just like taking that average and saying that's what we need to be. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, you should take an average based on like human health, not average of America society, which is it's just horrible.
Yeah, I actually, now that you said that, I did see that, and I was confused, but I probably only get my blood work done every couple of years. So yeah, that would not be good. But I did want to put my fat biopsy on the record. So I'm gonna tell a fat biopsy story, and then I'm gonna say that if you are ever asked to get one, you should just do it, because it's an experience. So I had a fat biopsy when I was probably 10 pounds over stage weight, like coming out of my competition season. And it was for one of the studies that we were doing, and they were training people on how to do it, right? So it was like a PA or a nurse practitioner, or somebody like well vetted was doing it, and had the MD right there. And so they're like, they take this needle that's it's not even a needle. It's like a pencil, and they shove it into your stomach, right? Like right around your belly button where the fat is. And that's like at that time the only place I'd put fat back on really that they could get to. But they're pulling suction through a tube. So it's like liposuction, right? So they stick a big ass needle in you and pulling suction through. And then it's like a metal toothbrush. They like scrub your fat. It was ridiculous. And it didn't hurt. Like you're numb. Like they shoot you up with lots of stuff. And they're pulling fat. And then like I'm like, okay, this is super weird because it feels like someone's rubbing the inside of my abs with like a metal device on the inside of my skin. And so that's what they were doing. So they get the fat, and I'm like, okay, we're good. We're good. I'm fine. I'm fine. So I get up, and my wife's there. And so I walk out of the room like, no, I'm good. All right, cool. And then I just black out just to the floor. And my wife is standing there and she's looking at me. She's like, oh my God, what happened? And so they put me, on my back and flip me over, put some ice on my stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm fine. My body's just freaking out. I can't stop that part. But she's like, you're never, ever doing another experiment again. Sorry.
Dude, needles are not, they're not, I did the same thing, but it was in the delivery room when I saw the epidural needle because it's massive. And the doctor says, Dad, don't look. And I was like, okay, what do? You look right at it because you want to see what he doesn't want you to look at. And I literally just go, oh, and just fainted. Felt so bad because it's like her moment and the nurses are like running over to me with apple juice trying to get me to wake up. And it was a whole deal. But speaking of biopsies, it actually brought up a question because I was talking, I think I was actually talking to my wife about this because I was like, oh, I want to be a part of an experiment. And she's like, why? And I was like, I don't know. I just want them to like do a muscle biopsy on me or something. She's like, well, what are they going to find in you that they can't figure out in somebody else? Why would you want to put yourself through that? And one of my reasonings was, I was like, well, I'm interested, like what fiber dominance I am. And my question is like that something that is even possible? Like, obviously it's hard to get a muscle biopsy, but like if I went and got a muscle biopsy and they were like, you are more fast twitch, and I could change my training to cater to that. Is that even, I think we've talked a little bit about muscle fiber typing, but it's a very interesting topic to me. Is that something, because I know a lot of research shows you should pretty much split it evenly. Like you should do a lot of both, but there are people who are dominant in one fiber type.
Yeah, so you can do that. I've actually done that on people. Is you can take a biopsy. There's a couple problems with it. One, so you only take like the size of your thumb size of muscle, so you don't know if that's necessarily representative of your whole like leg. Two, most people when they start training, everyone pretty much switches from type 2X to type 2A, so that's like a standard training transition, and then type 1 is kind of the slowest. So type 1A, type 2A, type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. So everybody goes towards type 2A with training. Now, I don't think you could really do anything in your training to switch your fiber type since you've been training for so long to optimize anything. Now, there are people who like you pull a biopsy out of a runner and they're going to have especially someone who's been running for a long time, a whole lot of type 1 fibers. I'm talking like I've pulled biopsies with like 80% of their fibers are type 1, and usually it's like 40%. So there's a genetic component, but there's also a training component too. So I don't know that like once you got to your like ideal training style, because you've been training for a long time, that you could do anything with that information. But it's super cool looking.
So that runner, because I think they did a study on twins, right? Where like one was a marathoner and one wasn't, and they were different. But with that runner, that endurance person, is there a benefit to them training in more of a type 2 fast twitch way to stimulate muscle growth? Or is it like, oh, you're mainly type 1, like let's use that, do more high rep bodybuilding, like don't worry about explosive work, don't worry about like low rep strength or anything like that?
Yeah, kind of. So I mean, if you're mostly type 1 and you're like more of an endurance person, like you want to stay in that lane, right? So you don't really want to change.
If that's what you want to continue doing.
Yeah. But there's not a lot of data show like with the idea of let's go mostly from type 1 to type 2A specifically. That switch is a much harder switch. So I'm not sure. It would probably happen to some extent, maybe like 5 or 6%, but I don't know.
I guess my whole like skepticism or even like speculation, like you remember the saying, which is, it's not a very accurate saying, but shock the muscle. You remember when people used to say shock the muscle? To me, I'm like, is this a scientific way to actually do that? Like you can kind of shock the system into growth, which we know. I think actually Greg Nuckols reviewed a study in Mass about this, and they saw no difference in anybody who did that, except the people who shifted from Olympic weightlifting to bodybuilding. And those people had never done bodybuilding before. So it was like years of Olympic weightlifting and then all of a sudden bodybuilding. And they saw this like huge spike in muscle growth for them compared to anybody else.
Yeah. And that would make sense. I mean, if you could do that to a runner too, probably, right? Or endurance-based athlete. Yeah. There's just not a lot of muscle biopsy literature in like people we care about.
Yeah. And I got to imagine it, like you said, it's hard if, all the muscles are different, parts of the muscles are different. And then it always comes up to a guessing game, right?
Yeah.
Like, but
I wish you could pick like, you could use one of those rep calculators and be like, you're X fast twitch dominant, but
yeah,
they just don't have any scientific realm right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's trial and error for people listening. If you're like the situation I could see where it'd be worth trying is if you are a small calf individual, then maybe do some like low rep, heavy, explosive work, something, because you walk all day. So they're probably going to be more type 1 anyway. But usually that's a genetic thing. People are born with small calves. They usually are stuck that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know. I have good calves, so I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, me too. I don't. It's funny. I told my coach, I was like, "Hey, just like, no, I don't do any of the calf raises you put on there. Like, I have no interest in them. My calves are fine." He's like, "All right, well, we'll use that time for something else." And I was like, "Perfect." Just being honest. But good, man. I like that. I think that wraps it up pretty well. Do you have anything else you want to throw out before we close this one off?
No, I think that's it. I think these are just some cool studies to show you how you can do science. And if listeners ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me and email me or DM me.
Yep, absolutely. So, guys, the link for this blog is in the description of this podcast, as well as my Instagram and Brandon's. Make sure you follow him because he posts a lot of these in infographic form that makes it really easy, and it's a good place to ask him questions. Last but not least, you can also fill out the form that is in this podcast description to fill out a podcast question, and that can be for research reviews too if you want. So that's a wrap. We'll catch you guys next time.